focus and think about some of the ways in which we can develop, grow, and hopefully improve in the days, weeks, and year ahead. And what I want to try to do with this series, it's 3 weeks, is each week take a look at a different lens of Teshuvah through a close analysis of rabbinic narratives, stories that appear in the Gemara. And the reason why I think that it's particularly important to do that is because when it comes to these kind of difficult, very personal, complex, whether it's interpersonal or even between a person and themselves and God, it's hard to look at the normative halachic realm for all the direction. It's often more enriching to examine the narratives that the rabbis tell about Teshuvah, around Teshuvah, and I think the stories we've picked for this series are particularly provocative and enlightening. But what I want to do first, as an introduction to the series, really, and I'll only do this week, is read a text that for a long time I couldn't totally figure out, but which I think provides us with a great deal of incentive to examine these rabbinic narratives. Okay? The text is on the front page. It's kind of the intro here. And it appears in a few different places, in a few different midrashim. Probably the most prominent place it appears is in the Talmud Yerushalmi, in the Jerusalem Talmud, where the following Agadah is stated. Okay? Sha'alu l'chachma. They asked wisdom. Hachotei mahu onsho. What should be the punishment of a sinner? Amra lahem. Wisdom replied, Chataim teradei fara'ah. Wicked people should be pursued by their sins. Quoting a verse in Proverbs and Mishlei. Sha'alu l'nevuah. They asked prophecy. Hachotei mahu onsho. What should be the punishment of a sinner? Amr lahem hanefesh hachotat hi tamut. Quoting the verse in Yecheskel, the sinning soul should die. Sha'alu Torah. So then they asked the 5 books of Moses. Chotei mahu onsho. Amr lahem yavi asham yitchaper lo. The sinner should bring a guilt offering, and that will be the atonement. Sha'alu lahakadosh baruch hu hachotei mahu onsho. They finally asked God what indeed should be the punishment of a sinner. Amar lahem ya'aseh teshuvah v'yitchaper lo. Let him repent, and it will be forgiven him. Hadahu dichtiv, as the verse in Tehillim says, Tov yashar Hashem. So this is an odd kind of narrative, and the question is, what are the rabbis driving at here when they talk about these embodied characteristics or works of the Bible and asking them the question, what's the point of this midrash? What does it seem to be stating?
Even though there's a justice, that there should be a punishment, there's a system of justice, God, the Almighty being of justice, is forgiving. He doesn't follow the laws of justice.
Good.
You don't have to be punished. You can atone and
Right.
back.
So in one sense, this is saying kind of Teshuvah is a divine gift, right? We may not, if we're going by strict justice, even following the strict justice of the text of the Bible itself, right? And I think here Chachma and Nevuah are portions of Tanakh, right? The books of wisdom, the wisdom books are like Mishlei and Kohelet and those, meaning if we would address the question of what's a sinner supposed to do, and you would look at the Bible itself, the answer, it appears, wouldn't be Teshuvah. And this is an important thing, Because very often we read into biblical texts and stories the concept of teshuvah because it's such a central concept in terms of how we think about Judaism. So, for example, if you look at the reading of Noah, the narrative of Noah and the flood generation, there's no discussion or there's no expression there of the possibility of teshuvah. Right? If you talk about Avraham and stone, it's not as if Avraham says to God, don't kill the people because give them a chance to do teshuvah. He says, don't kill the people because there are also righteous people there. It's almost as if in Tanakh, if there's an idea, the term teshuvah doesn't appear. There's shuv, there's return or there's turning, but one of the things that this text seems to be saying, in addition to the idea that teshuvah is transcends justice and that it's a divine gift, is that if we really want to understand teshuvah, we have to really we can't really look at biblical texts. We have to look at the rabbinic texts. And I think that's one of the reasons why specifically rabbinic texts give us a much more fully developed and complex system of how to do teshuvah, how that internal transformation works.
Does the word teshuvah appear in biblical texts?
Not in that conjugation. Right. There's
Sefer
shuv. So again, we point to teshuvah in Sefer Yonah, but we have to look carefully at what's being done in Sefer Yonah. The people are told, your city is going to be destroyed. Welcome. The people are told your city is going to be destroyed, and they decide to don sackcloth and fast and engage in some sort of process. The question is whether that process is what we know as teshuvah, or if that process is an attempt to kind of lower themselves so as to deserve some kind of divine mercy. And there may be a difference between those, and I don't want to get into it now, but yeah, if you look at Yonah carefully, it's a very odd book and story, especially since the teshuvah, the quote-unquote teshuvah movement includes the animals of Nineveh who are told to don sackcloth and are forbidden from eating. So it's not quite what we think of as kind of this transformative interior process where you regret what you've done and you take upon yourselves a certain way you're going to act in the future. So the thesis of kind of this overall class is that if we want to truly understand what teshuvah is, we really need to look at rabbinic texts to gain insight, and that this midrash is actually telegraphing that by creating this kind of mythic. We asked all these different books and midot, and none of them had the answer that we were looking for. The only way to find that answer is to understand God and to understand the rabbinic text that we're going to explore together.
Sorry,
Yeah.
maybe the point, the antecedent of the rabbinic concept that we're going to flush out here. So what is the closest that it is in the Torah? Does it come from someplace?
Right. So I think it does. I think there are hints to it. There's talk in Isaiah and in other texts about what's going to happen at the end of days and how there's going to be a return. But the kind of when we talk about like a personal transformation and transforming one's personality through introspection and confession and other things as a process and as a system doesn't really exist. You have I would say it's skeletal. You have confession when you bring a korban. So you have vidui when you sin, and you have the book of Yonah, and you have a description of what's going to happen at the end of days. And so you have a few of these things, but this idea of like we do a personal inventory and transformation is really only fully developed by Chazal.
When Miriam speaks Lashon Hara against Moshe,
Right. She's punished, but there isn't really a...
There's not a teshuvah.
Right.
Okay.
If you think of any biblical story carefully, and not through a lens that assumes that like the rabbis then engage in, oh, Noah built the Teva for 120 years. Why? Because so that the people of his generation would ask him, what are you doing? And he would say, well, God's going to destroy the world and you have to repent. But none of that appears in the biblical text. It doesn't seem like that. God looks out and says, okay, this is terrible, I got to start over again. It's not as if he instructs Noah, go ahead and tell the people that this is the way that they can transform themselves, and if they do vidui, and if they do this, they do that, they can do teshuvah. So I think that that's telling, and I think that that's kind of the message of this piece. So what I want to try to do today is do exactly that. Look at two stories that provide us with two paradigms of teshuvah in rabbinic literature, and then we're going to look at biblical antecedents to them, that when we look back, we can kind of see hints to these two models, okay? Along the way, we're also going to compare it to we're going to compare the rabbinic narratives to monastic literature, which is a fun and interesting point of comparison. At the same time that the rabbis are recording these stories, there are Christian monks in Egypt and other places who have eerily similar kinds of stories, and I think it's worthwhile to compare and contrast them if we want to know kind of what the project that the rabbis are engaging in, and then we'll circle back to the biblical antecedents of them. Okay. The other thing that we're going to be doing is looking at two stories about prostitutes. So that's the provocative piece. I think I called this Pretty Woman and the Penitents. It's just a little alliteration. And one of the things that is going to bother all of us when we read these texts is kind of the gender piece of this and the male-female dynamic. And we can talk about that a little bit, but I want to read these stories as teshuvah stories and less about power and sex and gender. That we'll do, hopefully, we'll have another chance to do. Last year with our alumni, we did a whole week of intensive learning on Judaism and sexuality, and these stories we discussed in that context. But today we're more focusing on the messages of teshuvah that emerge from these two stories. Okay? So I'm going to read the two stories and back to back, and then I want to invite you to kind of compare and contrast them. How are the stories similar? How are they different? And especially, I'll leave it at that. Okay. So the first one I remember hearing, somebody was asking me, I think Rochelle was asking me about my son at Gush. So I remember hearing this story just a few weeks into my first year in Israel, and it really had an impact on me at that time. And the other story we're going to see I only learned later on, and I think it's interesting developmentally. Okay, so this is a story of Rabbi Elazar ben Durdai, a famous passage about a particular figure that we don't know much else about other than this story, and we'll see why that's the case. Amru Alav al Rabbi Elazar ben Durdai. We're on page 2, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah 17a. I'll translate, not literally, but as we go along. They said about Rabbi Elazar ben Durdai, Shelo hiniach zona achad ba'olam shelo ba'ala. That there wasn't a single prostitute in the world that he did not conjugate with. Pam achat shama sheyesh zona achad b'krachei hayam v'haya notelet kis dinarin b'schara. So one time he heard that there is this mythic prostitute over many seas, one of the towns by the sea, and apparently she was quite pricey. So he takes with him a purse of dinarim for payment. Natal kis dinarim v'halach v'avar alav shivan arod. Right. So again, this is a mythic tale. He passes through 7 rivers on the way to get to her. Bishat hergel davar hificha. at the moment of consummating, when he finally reaches her and is about to consummate the relationship, the transactional relationship, he ficha. She blew forth breath. This is probably a euphemism, if you know what I mean, right? Okay. She I don't know what the proverbial cutting of the wind, right? He ficha, amra, and she said, she declared as in the immediate aftermath of that, kishem shahaficha zo eina chozeret limkoma, kach Elazar ben Durdai ein mekablin oto b'teshuvah. Okay, so she, the prostitute, says to him, just like that which just emerged from my body, it ain't ever coming back. That gas is not returning. So too, Elazar ben Durdai, he has no chance of coming back. Okay? Good. There's some quizzical looks. Halach v'yashav bein shnei harim ugvaot. He went and he sat between two mountains. Sorry, mountain, and valleys. Right? Between two hills and mountains, and he said, Harim ugvaot bikshu alai rachamim. Please, mountains and hills, beg mercy for me. I need your help. Amrulo ad sha'anu mevakshim alecha nevaket shalatzmeinu. Before we ask for mercy for you, we got to worry about ourselves. This starts at home. Shenemar ki harim yamushu v'agvaot timutena. Amar shamayim v'aretz. So he turns to heaven and earth. Bikshu alai rachamim. Please, beg mercy for my soul. Amru ad shanu mevakshim alecha nevakesh alatzmeinu. Heaven and earth respond, well, before we pray for you, we're going to pray for ourselves. Shenemar ki shamayim ka'ashan nimlachu v'aretz kebeged tibala. Amar chama levana. You get the point. He now turns to the sun and the moon. Bikshu alai rachamim. Beg mercy for me. Amru lo ad shanu mevakshim alecha nevakesh alatzmeinu. Etc. Amar kochavim mazalot. He turns to the stars and constellations. Bikshu alai rachamim, amru lo ad shanu mevakshim alecha nevakesh alatzmeinu. So finally, after turning to 4 or 5 different, again, not people, but
Nature.
Elements of nature, exactly. Finally, the protagonist says, Amar ein hadavar talui elabi. It all is riding on me. I'm not going to be able to get anybody else to intervene. There's no intermediary. There's no external inspiration even. It's all an internal process. Hiniach rosho bein birkav v'ga'a b'bechiyah ad sheyatzata nishmato. He placed his head between his knees and he wept loudly until his soul departed. Yatzisa bat kol va'amra. A heavenly voice was heard proclaiming, Rabbi Elazar ben Durdai mizuman l'chayei olam haba. Rabbi Elazar ben Durdai has made it into the world to come. Bacha Rebbe, upon hearing this, wept. V'amar yesh koneh olamo bekama shanim. There's certain people who, day in and day out, over many, many years, acquire their place in the world to come. V'yesh koneh olamo b'sha'acha. And then there's some who can do it in just an instant. Va'amar Rebbe lo dayan lebalei tshuva shemekablen ota. Not only was this Baal Tshuva and other Baalei Tshuva accepted, ela shekorinoto otan Rebbe. Going back to the beginning of the story and throughout, not only is Elazar ben Durdai, not only does he receive tshuva, he's also called Rebbe. He's given that title. Okay, before we look at the second story, just some initial reactions to this particular story. Again, I won't qualify it.
It just seems like personal responsibility is the height of what we're after in transformation.
Right. Could you see how, telling this to a group of Shana Aleph boys would be like a kind of slightly manipulative but very inspiring kind of talk? So I clearly remember this, right? Change is up to you if you want to do it. Okay. What else?
Not only can do it, but
Right.
it's that the transformative process is what Yahadut stands for.
Right, and don't look, and you can't look at, ultimately you can't look at nature to inspire you, you can't have other people help you, it's all on you.
Growth is the operative word.
Right, okay, good. Yes, Alyssa.
It's kind of harsh, though, that it required him basically dying to
Good.
achieve tshuva.
Good, that part we didn't put together.
That part bugs me.
Right.
Yeah.
This is tragic. Like, he can't live with what he's done and with taking responsibility for the weight and the burden of the fact that he lo hiniach zona achat ba'olam, that he hasn't, obviously this is a person who's been engaged in a life of debauchery, and the weight of that is so crushing that he, physically and emotionally can't lift himself up and continue and carry on.
But the other thing that's striking me is it's just that instant of its only realization. We don't see any process within his tshuva. It's just, I need to do it, but there's no
Okay, good.
explication of what he needs to do.
Good. Okay, good. Great.
Well, you could also be a little,
Charitable?
no,
The other way.
I don't know, maybe esoteric, and say that on earth we die when we have, our souls are taken when it's clear we cannot grow anymore.
Okay.
We have opportunities throughout our lifetime to grow and transform ourselves, but you die when your soul has reached its pinnacle.
Okay.
And he's weeping out loud,
Right. The whole.
indicated that he got it, that he understood, his soul understood where it needed to be fixed, and there was no purpose for him to live anymore.
Okay. Interesting. Okay.
My point was, but he didn't give me any guidelines or
Right.
any guideposts for how to get
So
there.
my question
Not that
is-
I'm so eager to get there.
What's the relationship between those? Meaning the fact that his tshuva kind of goes from 0 to 60 without any, steps along the way, and the fact that he can't live afterwards. I think those 2 points are going to be connected, but I think there's going to be more to it as well. So let's see the next story, and then yeah,
Just
Rich.
explain the setting of the story, like why do they present it?
The
This
context.
type of story.
So the context of this story is whether there are certain sins that we can't do tshuva for. That's the Gemara in Avodah Zarah. Is idol worship, is Avodah Zarah, is illicit relations. Are there any sins which we can't do tshuva for? And this is brought, I think, as a proof text that while you can do tshuva for it, it ultimately costs him his life. So that's the immediate context of that passage. Yes.
But what about the part that says you can either get it after living a life, an eternal life of many years,
Right.
or like in an hour, so you could just sin your whole life. Like, what's to prevent someone from saying, "Oh,
so
I can just do"?
we have
these
to
things my whole
understand
life,"
what
and then-
Is Rebbe annoyed by this?
Right. That's what I
Right. It's
mean.
not clear what his reaction to it is. Is he subverting the story? Is he saying like I've been working my whole life and this
Right.
knucklehead just woke up today and it's not fair. So we have to try to unpack that. We'll see if we can come back to that. I think that's a very fair point, and the story itself seems to kind of undercut it with Rebbe afterwards, unless we read it that Rebbe's kind of whiny and wrong in the matter. So I think that's interesting as well. Okay, the next story actually has earlier roots than the Elazar ben Dordai. It appears in the Midrash Halacha in the book of Bamidbar on the paragraph of tzitzit, which we'll see in a moment. But then it appears in the Gemara in Menachot, which has an extended discussion of the laws of tzitzis and a digression, as the Gemara always does, to some agadic material regarding tzitzit and kind of the protective amulet quality that tzitzit have. Similar to like mezuzah on a house, we're going to see the tzitzit in this story, like the wind cutting in the previous story, is the inspiration for change. Okay. Number 2. So we're on page 3. If you get bored, you can. I always love that Metropolitan Diary. That was like, I remember reading that in the actual paper and then looking for it many years later. Ma'aseh ba'adam echad shaya zahir b'mitzvat tzitzi. Okay, there was a particular student, as we're going to see, a disciple, who was scrupulous about the mitzvah of tzitzis. Shama sheyesh zona b'krachei hayam. There it is again. Right? He heard of a certain prostitute in one of the towns by the sea. Obviously, that's like a loaded term, having to, that's like the red light district. Krachei hayam equals rabbinic red light district. And I think these two Gemara are in conversation with each other, or I would say it like this. I think we should put these two Gemaras in conversation with each other once we now have, even that first line. Well, is this the same? Are we talking about the same woman? Is it possible? Is that supposed to be clicking? Shenotelet arba meot zehuvim bischara. So Rabbi Elazar ben Durdai, he brought a purse of dinarim, and in this story, she charges 400 gold coins. Shiger la arba meot zehuvim v'kavala zman. He procured and sent her the money, and they set up a time. Higia zmano ba v'yashav ala petach. When the day came, he went and he waited at the door. Now this is for another time, but just that image I think is a great image. There are a number of images like that in the Gemara, especially around Teshuvah, of being at the doorstep, like this kind of liminal. That's really like, are you going in or are you staying out? It's not a coincidence that he's sitting at the doorway, not entering, but also not turning around. Nichnesa shifchata. So the helper of the prostitute comes out to him. V'amrla, oto adam shishiger lech. Oto adam shishiger lech daled me'at zuvim ba v'yashav ala petach. She informs her boss that in fact the man is here. Amrahi yikanes, and so she said, "Let him come in." Okay, so he now comes in. Nichnas, he enters. And what did she do? Hitzia lo sheva mitot. She set up for him 7 beds. This is the most elaborate bunk bed ever, right? 7 beds. Sheish shel kesef v'achad shel zahav. 6 silver beds, and on top a 7th gold bed. Ubein kol achad v'achad. In between each bed, sulam shel kesef. A silver ladder was connecting them. The elyona shel zav. Okay. So this is just like in the other story, he crosses rivers to get to her. This is also kind of was it 7 rivers there?
Yes.
7, right. 7 is like the full, complete thing. He's got to climb up 7 beds to reach her. And he does. Alta v'yashva al gabe elyona kishihiruma. He ascends, and she ascends, goes up to the top bed and waits for him naked. And then he too goes up after her, and he too is without clothing. Bo'u daled tzitziotav. The 4 corners of his garment then come along, v'taflulo al panav, and wrap him across the face. Nishmat, and it causes him to fall down the ladders. V'yashav lo al gabe karka, and he ends up sitting back on the floor. Va'af hi nishmita v'yashva al gabe karka, and she follows him, slides down the ladders, and they're now sitting, the 2 of them, naked on the floor after the near consummation. Amra lo, she says to him, Gapa shel Romi. So they translate here, this is from since, by the Roman capital, but this may be a reference to a Roman god. Like, dear God, she'eni menichatcha ad shetomar li mam ra'ita bi. And here we get into kind of the whole gender thing. Like, she says to him, you're not going anywhere until you tell me, what flaw did you behold in me that caused you to stop? Amar la, he says, no, ha'avodah, by the temple service, right? So she's referencing the Roman god, he's referencing the temple service. Shelo ra'iti isha yafa kamotech. I've never seen a woman more beautiful than you. Ela mitzvah achat tzivanu Hashem Elokeinu v'tzitzit shma. There is this mitzvah. It's called tzitzis. Uksiv ba ani Hashem Elokeichem shtei pamim. And in that final paragraph of Shema, it says, "I am the Lord your God" 2 times. Anihu shati li parei, anihu shati l'shalem sachar. And we derive from that the Lord is our God who will both pay us back and give us our comeuppance if we don't do things right, and who will eventually give us reward. Achshav nidmu alai kar ba'edim. And the tzitzit appeared before me like 4 sets of witnesses and admonished me. Amrolo, she now amends her words and says, Eini menichacha ad shetomar li ma shemech. Tell me what your name is. I'm not letting you leave here until you tell me your name. Uma shem ircha, what city you're from. Uma shem rabcha, and who your teacher is. Uma shem midrashecha, and what base medrash you learn in. Shatala made bo Torah. Katav v'natan biyada. He writes it and gives it into her hand, which is an interesting phrase. Amda v'chilka kol nechaseha. She goes ahead and gets up and splits up all of her possessions, which were by this point, after a significant portion of her life, charging what she did for prostitution. She had a lot of money. Shlish l'malchut. She was apparently running the business off the books. So she gave 1/3 to the government. V'shlish la'aniyim. 1/3 she gave to the poor. V'shlish natla biyada. And 1/3 she held on to. Chutz me'otan matzaot. Except for those beddings, those special beddings, which were kind of the source, the items which most represented her past indiscretions. But what does she do? She takes those with her. Ubata lebeit midrasho shel Rabbi Chia, and she comes to the base medrash of Rabbi Chia. This student was apparently a student of Rabbi Chia. Amra lo Rabbi tziva alai v'asuni gioret. This now becomes a conversion story. She says, Rabbi, I want you to convert me. Teach me. Amar Allah, he's a little bit dubious. Maybe her reputation preceded her. We don't know. BT, shema einecha natata be'echan min hatalmidim. Perhaps the only reason why you're here is that you have set your eyes on one of the disciples and maybe are looking to ensnare him in bad. We don't know exactly what he's worried about. Hotzia k'tav miyadav v'natna. So she takes out the written parchment that she has, and she gives it to Rabbi Chia, and presumably tells him the story. Amarla, and he says to her, Lechi, go, zechi b'mikchech. Go take hold, enjoy what you've acquired. Otan matzaot shehitzia lo bi'isur, those very bedclothes which you or she had spread for him for an illicit purpose, hitzia lo beheter. She now spread out for him lawfully. Okay. Reactions to this story. Comparisons and contrasts with the other story.
Well, it's such a complicated story.
Yeah.
It's so elaborate.
Very.
It's so confusing in a way.
Right. Well, one of the things that's really confusing and a point of contrast is in the first story, he's the protagonist. And Elazar ben Durdai remains the protagonist from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. The role of the prostitute is a secondary one. She's a prop, if you will, in the story that says something to him which triggers a response, but then she disappears. In this story, she becomes the protagonist, right? It starts off, we're talking about this ma'aseh ba'adam echad, but the story is not really about him. The story ends up being about her, right? And her reaction to being rejected and then the conversation that ensues. So, okay. So there's we already pointed out some points of commonality, the prostitute, the traveling, the traversing obstacles, the expensive, the nearly consummating until there's some kind of external trigger. In one case, her bodily function. In the other case, the tzitzit which smack him. So all those points are similar. And there's lots of conversations. In the first story, there's conversations between him and the mountains, and him and the stars, and him and the sun and the moon, and him and the heaven and earth. And in the second story, who are the conversations between? Yeah. Like that image of them totally exposed, literally and figuratively, and sitting down and having a conversation, I think is really powerful. Okay? What else is different about the stories?
Well, the contrast that you mentioned, I think the point is that if you're a great rabbi and a Talmud Chacham and you're going to be called Rebbe, or you're a Zonah,
Right.
you can do Teshuvah if you are so moved and see a character piece. She saw a character piece that he was able to stop himself because of some transcendent concept
Right.
that impressed her.
Mm-hmm.
So just like it didn't take him a lifetime, it took him an hour to see the light, it took her a moment to understand something she hadn't understood before and changed her life because of it. So two things are taught. You could be a whore or you could be a rabbi. You will have issues in life, but you can change. And it isn't necessarily a long process. It could be by a conversation, it could be
Okay.
a lifetime endeavor.
Okay, what's the key difference though in the two stories besides her becoming the main protagonist in the second story and
They live.
at least like is focusing on the endings. That first story is terrible. It's depressing. It's horrible. It's inspiring when I heard it for the first time at 17 years old and thought, I can transform myself in an instant. But the end of that story is pretty terrible. He dies alone with his hand between his knees. The second story is a happily ever after story, right? We don't really know his name. We don't really know their identities, but she comes to seek him out after this exchange and after transforming her life and putting her things in order. And what's amazing, there's just a little bit on the gender, is typically the way it works in marriage is that the man gives something to the woman to effect some kind of kinyan, some kind of transactional quality. Here, the rabbi instructs her, go ahead, zechi b'mechech, go and take your acquisition. It's almost like she's the one who's acquiring the student through that piece of paper. So there's a lot going on in these stories, and I think, to me, the biggest question that emerges from the two stories is, what explains the difference in the two outcomes? Why is it that in the first story, he can't carry on, he can't move on, and though he becomes a rabbi and transforms himself, he ultimately expires from that realization, whereas in the second story, it seems as if they're able to move on. There's a certain continuity with her past that's really remarkable. She takes the stuff that had been the source of the illicit things, she takes those matzaot, the beddings, and now they become the chuppah, it sounds like, the bridal canopy. There's something really powerful about what this story is saying about taking our past with us and bringing it forward and being able to see the continuity between our past and elevate the past in a way that allows us to bring it with us. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week in a different story. And whereas the first story, he's crushed, Elazar ben Durdai is crushed by the weight of his past and apparently doesn't see any way forward other than to just, burst out into tears. And what I want to try to get to is what accounts for the different endings, what accounts for an ability to be able to bring our past with us and elevate it in a powerful way, integrate it into who we are in a meaningful fashion as the second story represents, and what prevents that from happening in the first story. Now you could say what prevents it in that first story, he's just so bad. It's comparing apples and oranges. He's the guy who's never left a prostitute in the entire world that he hasn't been with. And in this second story, it sounds like it's a nice yeshiva bacher who, saw an ad somewhere and, lost his mind, but then kind of the tzitzis help bring him back. So you could say it's just that, but I think there's more. In order to, yeah.
What I'm seeing is the human interaction, not so much him talking to, but there's
Good.
it's like an edict at the end. She says, "There's no way for you to do tshuva. There's like no hope." In the
Good.
second story, he sort of gives now and gives later. That promise of later
Good.
is the promise of the potential for change.
Great. So we're going to come back to that. I want to do one more thing first. If your minds haven't been blown by these two stories sufficiently, we will now take a look at a contemporaneous story that was told. Again, this is translated from Arabic. This is from a collection of called Harlots of the Desert, a study of repentance in early monastic sources. This is now a popular, in the last 10, 15 years, has become a more popular area of interest for Talmud scholars, is to compare and contrast portions of the Talmud with what's going on in other religions and in other communities at that time. That's always been something popular, but specifically monastic sources and some Sasanian sources in Persia and the like. These are Christian monastic sources that are rooted in Egypt, like around 4th, 5th century. So I'm going to just read this story and just think, again, where does this story fall in terms of the previous two stories? What are the points of commonality and contrast with each of them? There was a certain harlot called, I think it's Thais. And she, what?
Yeah, there's an opera, Thais.
Right. There was a certain harlot called Thais, and she was so beautiful that many for her sake sold all that they had and reduced themselves to utter poverty. Right? Arba meo dinarim. Quarrels arose among her lovers, and often the doorstep, again that doorstep of this girl's house, was soaked in the blood of young men fighting over her. When Abba Paphnutius heard about it, he's a Christian priest, we're going to see. He put on normal clothes and went to see her in a certain city in Egypt. He handed her a silver piece as the price for committing sin. She accepted the price and said, "Let us go inside." When he went in, he sat down on the bed, which was draped with precious covers. Right? It's remarkable how many similarities there are. And he invited her, saying, "If there is a more private chamber, let's go in there." She said, "There is one, but if it is people you are afraid of, no one ever enters this room, except, of course, for God, for there is no place that is hidden from the eyes of divinity." When the old man heard this, he said to her, "So you know there is a God?" She answered him, "I know about God and about the eternal kingdom and also about the future torments of sinners." "But if you know this," he said, "why are you causing the loss of so many souls that you'll be condemned to render an account not only for your own sins, but of theirs as well?" When Thais heard this, she threw herself at the feet of Paphnutius and begged him with tears, "Give me a penance, Father, for I trust to find forgiveness by your prayers. I beg you to wait for just 3 hours, and after that, wherever you tell me to go, I will go, and whatever you tell me to do, I will do it." Little shades of Ruth and Naomi there, right? A little bit. So Paphnutius arranged a meeting place with her, and she went out and collected together all the goods that she had received by her sins, right? Piled them all together in the middle of the city, while all the people watched, saying, "Come here, all of you that have sinned with me, and see how I am burning whatever you gave me." Okay? Torches it all. The government doesn't get anything. The poor don't get anything. She certainly doesn't keep anything. When it was all consumed, she went to the place that the father had arranged with her. Then he sought out a monastery of virgins and took her into a small cell, sealing the door with lead and leaving only a small opening through which food could be passed to her. And he ordered her to be given daily a little bread and a little water by sisters in the monastery. When Thais realized that the door was sealed with lead, she said to him, "Father, where do you want me to urinate?" And he replied, "In the cell, as you deserve." Then she asked him how she should pray to God. And he said to her, "You are not worthy to name God or to take his divine name upon your lips. or to lift up your hands to heaven. For your lips are full of sin, and your hands are stained with iniquity. Only stand facing toward the east and repent often only this: you who made me, have mercy upon me. The story then goes on, and she ultimately dies in that cell. Elazar ben Durdai style. So there are many points of resemblance, and for time, I'm going to try to summarize them. It's impossible to ignore the resemblance between this legend and the two stories we've told, especially the one about the tzitzit. They describe a pious man leaving his home to meet a prostitute. In both cases, the meeting results in a dialogue regarding the tenets of faith and the moral order, and at the behest of the pious man, the prostitute abandons her life of sin, discards her property, and enters the world of faith. But there are many points of difference. The first and most remarkable difference is one of motive. The Christian saint seems to be moved to visit the prostitute by his sense of faith and morality and his interest in preventing bloodshed among young men. Now, I once taught this before and people disagreed with me. They thought that he was going in order to consummate a relationship with her. How did you read Abba Paphnutius going to meet with her? Did you think he was going to... So I don't think... Just maybe part of this is the way she interprets it, Benedicta Ward, and also just the way those stories works. The monastic fathers don't do anything wrong. They're perfect.
So why did he change into regular clothes?
I think he wanted to be able to get in,
Like
to be undercover,
Right.
to then
That's what I was thinking.
and to also be able to talk to her
Right.
and wake her up, because it doesn't describe him. Again, you could see asking to get inside, but it seems like he's waiting for the moment to hit her with the Teshuvah talk.
Maybe the ambiguity is part of
Right.
the narrative.
Certainly in terms of drawing us in, it does that. But in looking back and seeing how he presented in the rest of the story, it sounds like his initial motivation is probably to, redeem her and
Right, because it says that when he heard about it, and then it's the sentence before, it's the blood of the young men, fighting.
Right.
It doesn't say he heard about this prostitute
Right.
who was so beautiful.
right.
But
Right.
she made the assumption.
Right. Correct. Okay. So here's what's interesting. The Christian saint is interested in preventing the bloodshed. The Jewish men, on the other hand, are motivated by lust. The Christian legend contrasts the perfect saint, the pious father Paphnutius, with the paradigmatic sinner, the prostitute. Whereas in the Jewish sources, none of the heroes really exemplifies perfection. Everyone sins, some repent, and everyone receives their just rewards. So we can compare the women in the stories, but it's hard to compare the different men. In the Jewish stories, everyone's a sinner, and in the Jewish story, the women effectuate the Teshuvah in the men, and there are no perfect saints. Another critical difference between the rabbinic stories and the legend is the type of conversion each of the prostitutes undergoes. In the Tzitzit Midrash, the female protagonist undertakes her actions independently. The student does not attempt to convince her, nor does she require his convincing. She is promised neither marriage nor redemption, but rather undertakes both of her own accord. Teshuvah unfolds in the context of the relationship between these two sinners. But in the Christian story, the prostitute entrusts herself completely to the priest, pledging to follow his will to the letter. The sinning woman obeys her Redeemer unquestioningly out of fear that left to herself, she would be overwhelmed by her own appetites. There is only one point at which the harlot Thais acts as an autonomous object, when she chooses to burn all of her property in the town square. And here again, the apparent similarity between that narrative and the Tzitzit narrative belies a critical difference. The Egyptian prostitute destroys the spoils of her world of sin completely. In the Jewish story, she brings her belongings, the bedclothes, and the third of the money with her to the Beit Midrash. The prostitute in the Agad has a degree of power to repent and to elevate her past. There is a lot to say about these stories, but I think ultimately the contrast is very powerful, and this latter story, the Christian story, actually has more commonalities with the Elazar ben Durdai. Just like in the end he sits and dies and expires, so too she does here as well. And I think the key difference in the two stories is something that's already been touched upon. And that is specifically, it's not a coincidence that in the story with the tzitzit, the two sinners sit down together and have a conversation and talk about why it is that what's happened has happened. And whereas Rabbi Elazar ben Durdai's story, the prostitute says something which inspires him to rethink his life, she's no longer a part of the story. And in the Christian story, it's not a bilateral kind of dialogue. It's she submits and says, whatever you tell me I have to do, I'll do. And I think talking about the sin and what's going on shares the burden, and that's precisely what allows in the story of the tzitzit for her to bring her past with her. It's not a coincidence that story ends happily. It's the very fact that they share that important dialogue, and she asks, well, what happened? And he says, well, it's not you, it's this. And they go back and forth. I think that's the key to understanding why that story ends in a happy fashion. The Agadot suggest that intimate, uncomfortable, exposed moment of healing can be at play in a tshuva moment. And I think this is what's interesting. A lot of times we think like interpersonal sins, you need to have a conversation and work things out. But it seems as if there's value in having someone to work things out with, even when it's sins that are not necessarily interpersonal, right? The sins here, even though you could say the power dynamic and there is an exploitation, we're leaving that aside for now, but the sin here seems to be between man and God, and yet in the story with the tzitzit, it's their dialogue that they share which allows the prostitute to bring her past forward, and that transformation happens only as a result of that. I don't know if it's talk therapy or just the dialogue itself, which allows them to move forward through the discomfort. So I think what we really see in this is the power of having a deep dialogue, not just with oneself. And that's why Elazar ben Durdai, he turns to the mountains. It's all, Eina davar talui elabi, is actually not a heroic statement. It's actually a statement that we can look at critically and say, if that's your attitude towards tshuva, then you're not going to be able to unburden yourself in a way which allows you to move forward with other people, with your own sense of who you are. Does that make sense? And I think it's really a powerful, that language of Eina davar talui elabi. And I want to just share very briefly the biblical paradigms that I think exist for the biblical antecedents. One is a terrible story in Shmuel Bet. Both involve David, who's kind of the paradigm of, again, if you want to look at personal tshuva stories in the Bible, David is probably the best. David and Bathsheba is probably the best place to look, and David's life in general. So this is a really terrible story. There's a famine for 3 years, and David tries to find out what happened, and he asks God, and God said, well, it has to do with Shaul, and it has to do with what happened to the Givonim. He points to two different things. Shaul had wiped out the whole city, and that was bad. And so David seems to understand that he has to make amends to the Givonim, and there's some kind of negotiation, and eventually David hands over relatives of Shaul, 11 something, relatives of Shaul to the Gibeonites to be slaughtered. Yeah, it's a terrible story. It's the end of Shmuel Bet, so we don't always get to it. Okay? Really bad story. Really bad story. There's a fascinating rabbinic retelling of this story in source number 5 on page 5. Okay? And the Gemara, like it does, comments on each verse and each phrase what happens. But here's what's cool, and this is how I found it. I put in Bar Ilan, Eina davar talui elabi, because I wanted to see how is that phrase understood in rabbinic literature, right? Because I understood it as personal responsibility. It's beautiful, wonderful. We're going to see the only other place it appears, it's also really tragic. What happens? there's a famine in the days of David, 3 years, year after year. In the first year he said to them, is it possible that there are idolaters among you? No, they instituted inquiries but could not discover any idolaters. In the second year he asked, well, maybe there are other types of sins? They looked around for other types of sins. None was found. In the third year he said to them, well, maybe there are people who have promised to give charity in public and haven't given them. Apparently that was a problem then too. And they looked into it and nothing came of it. So David concluded, right, after 3 years of inquiry into other people's problems and sins, Amar ein hadavar talui elabi. David HaMelech says, okay, I got to take care of this. And I'm going to argue that that's where this story now turns tragic. Once a person says, it's all on me, and doesn't seek to create a dialogue around what they feel like they've done wrong or what needs to be fixed, that's when tragedy strikes. So what does he do? He reaches out to God, and God explains that he inquired, the Reish Lakish said he inquired of the Urim and Thummim, and the Lord said it is for Saul and his bloody house because he put to death the Gibeonites. For Saul, because he was not mourned for in a proper manner, which is an interesting point in its own right. Even though Shaul at the end of his life really was pretty terrible, nevertheless he didn't get a proper state funeral, and that was a problem. And his bloody house because he put to death the Gibeonites. Wherever do we find that Saul put to death the Gibeonites? The truth is that he killed the inhabitants of Nov, the city of the priests, who were supplying them with water and food. Okay? So what happens? According to this Gemara, David tries to figure out why there's a famine, and it emerges that there's a famine because of the way in which the city, Nov, Ir Kohanim, was wiped out. By wiping out that city, this is a crazy thing, but wiping out that city, the people from Givon, whose jobs came from that city, like this is a whole kind of welfare program. The jobs came from the city of Nov. It was Shaul's fault and the Jewish people's fault as a whole that they prevented the Gibeonites from making a living because Shaul wiped out Nov. He didn't do anything directly to the people of Givon. Fine. What ends up happening, though, in the verses, is that David eventually gives 7 people, not 11, 7 people from the house of Shaul as payback, and they were hanged in Givat Shaul, and that's what ends up happening. It's a terrible story, but I think what the clue there of Eina Davar Talui Elabi is where David goes wrong is when he says, okay, this is on me, I have to solve this problem. And that's to be contrasted with the story, which is probably the best antecedent in the Bible of personal tshuva, which is the aftermath of the death of the son born to Bathsheba from her consorting with David. Right before Shlomo is born, Bathsheba has a child from her initial encounter with David. That child dies, right? We're familiar with that story. Natan tells him the mashal. David says, ooh, I messed up, chatati. And he tries to save the life of the baby dies. So if you look, after the baby dies, there's an incredible pasuk, which I never appreciated until reading these stories. Vayinachim David et Bathsheba ishto. David comforted Bathsheba, his wife. This is the first time she's called ishto. He had married her already, but she was always Bathsheba Eshet Uriah until David comforts her. Vayavo eleha vayishkav hima vatelid bein vatikrad shmo Shlomo v'Hashem ahevo vayishlach biad Natan hanavi vayikrad shmo Yedidyah ba'avur Hashem. That one phrase, and David comforted Bathsheba, I think is the key to understanding how they're able to build a life together after this horrible the horrible beginning of the relationship. Even though, right? What would we imagine would happen after the sin of David and Bathsheba? He's humiliated. They suffer this terrible loss. There should be anger, mutual recrimination, the blame game. And instead we have David comforting his wife, dialogue and intimacy followed by regeneration in life. And relationships that were broken are now made whole, even though they're forever changed by their tragedy. It's after this moment of dialogue and comfort between David and Bathsheba that we learn that the Lord loved Shlomo, and perhaps by extension, David and Bathsheba too. Earlier in the chapter, Bathsheba is always described as Uriah's wife, and only now, after they go through this post-sin stage together, are they husband and wife. Sin followed by exposure and dialogue is painful, it's difficult, it's chilling, but it seems that's the biblical antecedent, the pretty woman who serves as the basis for our story here. So in conclusion, we're 2 minutes overtime. There seem to be two very different models of teshuvah that are offered by these two parallel stories. The first, which is how I think I have tended to operate, is very much keeping it in a davar talui elabi, between me and God. And yes, when it comes to interpersonal stuff, it's important to approach the offended party. But for the most part, when it comes to bein adam l'makom, the teshuvah is internal. But the second model offers us another way. It's dialogue with community, with a spouse, with friends, with close loved ones, opening myself up to real change by engaging in dialogue about what we failed and what our ambitions are going forward. This is not a bein adam l'makom, bein adam l'chaver distinction. What we're talking about here is opening up about various types of sins to those whom we feel we have the closest connection to. And this seems to be impossibly difficult, at least in many cases. But sometimes, through the crushing truth being acknowledged, we're able to eventually engage in a process of change and transformation. I think that's a part of the message of what Kohelet says. Tovim hashnayim min ha'echad asher yesh lahem sachar tov ba'amalam ki im yipolu ha'echad yakim et chaveiro v'ilu ha'echad she'yipol ve'ein sheni la'akimo. Two are better than one, since they can have reward for their toil together. And if one falls, the other person can lift that other individual up. Elazar ben Durdai didn't turn to anyone else to lift him up, and ultimately his end is tragic, whereas the tzitzit narrative tells us the story of two individuals who support each other and therefore are able to build a life together. Have a great day.